The bridge that should not have existed. March 7th, 1945. 3 p.m. The Rhine River, Remagen, Germany. The air was thick with smoke, the kind that stings the eyes and smells of cordite and mud. From the western bank of the Rhine, a column of American armor crawled forward. Tanks from the 9th Armored Division, their olive-drab hulls smeared with the soot of 200 miles of relentless advance. The men were exhausted, hungry, and soaked to the bone. But as they reached the ridge overlooking the town of Remagen, what they saw below made them freeze in disbelief. There it was, the Ludendorff Bridge, still standing. For months, Allied reconnaissance flights had reported that every major bridge over the Rhine, every single one, had been destroyed by retreating German forces. The Rhine was Hitler's last natural barrier, the final defensive line before the heart of Germany itself. And yet, against all odds, one bridge remained. Lieutenant Karl Timmermann, just 24 years old and commanding the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion, pulled his binoculars tight against his face. He couldn't believe it either. "Jesus," he whispered, "it's still there." Across the river, the town of Erpel smoldered behind German lines. The bridge, a dark steel span flanked by two massive stone towers, was guarded by anti-aircraft guns and machine positions. Beneath it flowed the wide gray Rhine, swollen by winter rain and melting snow from the Alps. It was nearly 400 meters across and the only thing between the Americans and Germany's industrial heartland. The order from headquarters was clear. If you see an intact bridge, seize it at once. But that order came with an unspoken understanding. No one expected such a thing to happen. Timmermann lowered his binoculars. "We've got one shot at this," he said to his men, "and we're taking it." The race against detonation. As the first platoons prepared to move, thunder rolled from the east. German artillery. Shells screamed overhead, landing behind the American lines, kicking up mud and shrapnel. The men ducked instinctively, but Timmermann didn't flinch. His focus was locked on the bridge towers, where he could see the faint outlines of German engineers moving frantically. Wires, crates, detonators. "They're going to blow it!" someone shouted. Timmermann slammed his hand against the side of his half-track. "Go! Go now!" The tanks of Task Force Engemann roared forward, treads grinding against the wet earth. Behind them, squads of infantry sprinted through the open fields, machine gun fire whistling past their helmets. Smoke grenades were hurled to obscure their movement, filling the valley with a white haze. Up ahead, the 88mm guns opened up from the German side, firing across the bridge in blind desperation. The first Sherman tank returned fire, its 75mm shell exploding against the base of a tower. A second tank followed, hammering the opposite side. Inside the bridge, Captain Willy Brage, the German officer in charge of the defense, knew the situation was hopeless. He had only a handful of men left, and a bridge rigged with more than 600 pounds of explosives. The charges had been placed days earlier, but the detonators were unreliable, and the cables had been damaged by bombing raids. At 3:45 p.m., he gave the order, "Blow the bridge." A deafening explosion rocked the valley. Flames burst from the western end, throwing debris into the air. The Americans dropped to the ground. When the smoke cleared, the impossible had happened. The bridge still stood. Half the charges had failed. The steel span was damaged, but intact. Timmermann saw his moment. "They missed. Move," he yelled. The first to cross. Under relentless German fire, the 9th Armored's engineers surged forward. Sergeant Eugene Dorland led the first group onto the bridge, bullets sparking off the steel around them. The sound was deafening. The clatter of machine guns, the echo of boots on iron, the roar of the Rhine beneath. The men expected another explosion at any second. Every step was a gamble. Beneath the bridge, German sappers floated on rafts, trying to ignite additional charges with fuses and hand grenades. Above them, American riflemen picked them off one by one. By 4 p.m., the first Sherman tank reached the bridge ramp. Its engine growled as it rolled forward onto the trembling steel. "Are you out of your mind?" one engineer shouted over the noise. "Maybe," the tank commander yelled back, "but someone's got to go first." The tank crept across, its treads clanging against the metal grates. The bridge swayed but held. Behind it, more tanks followed, then trucks, then infantry, hundreds of men pouring across the Rhine under the thunder of German artillery. From the opposite bank, German officers watched in disbelief. General von Brockdorff-Ahlefeldt, commanding the local defense sector, reportedly slammed his fist on the table. "It cannot be," he shouted. "They are crossing the Rhine on that bridge?" By nightfall, 8,000 Allied troops were across. For the first time since Napoleon, a hostile army had crossed the Rhine into Germany by force. Hitler's fury and the engineers' triumph. News of Remagen spread like wildfire through Allied headquarters. Eisenhower's staff could hardly believe it. Patton, who was preparing his own crossing further south, was furious but impressed. "Leave it to the 9th Armored to find a damn bridge nobody else saw," he said. In Berlin, the reaction was very different. When Adolf Hitler received the report, he went into a fit of rage. He screamed at his generals, accused them of treason, and ordered the arrest of every officer connected to the defense of Remagen. 5 were executed by firing squad. The Führer called it the shame of the Rhine. Meanwhile, American engineers worked through the night to reinforce the bridge. They patched holes with steel plates, replaced beams, and built floating pontoon supports beneath it. Every few hours, German artillery tried to destroy it, and every time the engineers repaired the damage faster than it could be inflicted. For 10 days, the Ludendorff Bridge carried an unbroken flow of men, tanks, and supplies into Germany. Then, on March 17th, weakened by repeated hits and strain, it finally collapsed into the Rhine, killing dozens of engineers. But by then, it no longer mattered. The Allies had already established multiple crossings, and Germany's western defenses were in ruins. The bridge at Remagen had done the impossible. It opened the gateway to the heart of the Reich. And to the German generals who watched the footage afterward, one thought echoed above all others. A bridge appeared overnight, and with it, the end of the war. Aftermath and legacy. The bridge that changed the war's endgame. March 17, 1945. Remagen, Germany. The morning mist hung low over the Rhine. For 10 days, the Ludendorff Bridge had carried an unbroken torrent of men and steel into the heart of Germany. And now, its strength had finally given out. At 3 p.m., the massive span groaned under the weight of tanks and trucks. Rivets snapped like gunshots. Soldiers working beneath it heard a sickening metallic scream. And then, the center section buckled. The entire structure folded in on itself, collapsing into the river below. Engineers on the scaffolds were thrown into the icy current. Sergeant Frank Huffman remembered the moment vividly. It sounded like the world was ending. Steel tearing, men shouting, the whole thing going down like a dying giant. 31 men were killed in the collapse. But as General William Hoge stood on the riverbank, watching the debris drift away, he didn't mourn the bridge. He knew what it meant. Its mission was complete. The Allies had crossed the Rhine. The shockwave across Germany. In the days that followed, the The psychological impact of Remagen rippled across the German command structure like a detonation. For months, Hitler's generals had promised him that the Rhine would hold. It was Germany's ancient shield, its final barrier, the line where they would make their last stand. Now, that illusion was gone. All across the front, morale began to collapse. Entire German divisions started falling back without orders. Wehrmacht soldiers whispered, "If they crossed at Remagen, they can cross anywhere." Intercepted German radio messages captured the panic. The Americans are over the Rhine. They are inside Germany. In Berlin, Hitler's rage reached a fever pitch. He called Remagen a national disgrace and demanded to know who was responsible. His paranoia deepened. He accused the Wehrmacht of sabotage, cowardice, even conspiracy. Within days, 5 officers associated with the bridge's defense were executed after sham trials, including General Major Richard von Bothmer and Major Hans Scheller. Their deaths sent a message. No failure would be forgiven, but fear could not rebuild the Rhine. The engineers' miracle. As the wreckage sank beneath the Rhine, American engineers were already at work on the next miracle. Within 24 hours of the collapse, they began constructing 2 floating pontoon bridges, one for infantry and one for armor. The speed was breathtaking. Working under artillery fire, the engineers used prefabricated sections, bulldozers, and amphibious vehicles to assemble crossings that stretched hundreds of meters. By March 19th, tanks were rolling over again as if nothing had happened. A sergeant from the 276th Engineer Combat Battalion described it best. "We were soaked, deaf, and half crazy from lack of sleep, but no one stopped. That river wasn't going to hold us back. Not anymore." Eisenhower himself visited Remagen that week. Standing among the twisted girders, he shook his head in awe. "This bridge," he said, "shortened the war by weeks, maybe months." The flood into Germany. From Remagen, the flood began. The U.S. First Army poured eastward into the Rhineland. Within 10 days, the bridgehead had expanded to nearly 25 miles wide. The 9th Armored Division was followed by the 78th Infantry, then by Patton's 3rd Army from the south. As more pontoon bridges appeared across the Rhine, the German Western Front began to dissolve. Towns that had once been symbols of Nazi pride, Bonn, Koblenz, Cologne, fell in rapid succession. Roads were jammed with retreating German units, refugees, and abandoned equipment. The Luftwaffe tried desperate attacks on the bridgeheads, sending jet-powered Me-262s to bomb the crossings. It didn't matter. Allied anti-aircraft fire shredded most of them before they even reached their targets. By late March, the Rhine, once considered an impenetrable barrier, was just another river behind the front line. Remagen in Hitler's mind. Inside the Führer bunker, Remagen became a symbol of betrayal. Hitler's fury grew more erratic, his circle shrinking. He refused to believe the Americans had simply been faster, better equipped, and better supplied. In his mind, the only explanation was treachery. When reports arrived that U.S. troops were closing on Frankfurt, he reportedly slammed his hand on the map and shouted, "They crossed the Rhine because my generals are cowards." Joseph Goebbels tried to spin the Remagen crossing as a temporary incursion soon to be eliminated. But the German people no longer believed propaganda. Everyone knew the truth. The enemy was inside Germany. The human side of victory. While generals calculated miles and divisions, the men who took the bridge remembered it differently. Private First Class Joe Delicio later said, "It wasn't about strategy that day. We were scared to death. We just ran across that bridge hoping it wouldn't blow up under us. When we made it to the other side, we didn't feel like heroes. We just felt alive. Many of those men would go on to fight through the Ruhr Pocket, one of the last great battles on the Western Front, where over 300,000 German soldiers would be captured. The crossing at Remagen had set that domino in motion. The end of the road. By April 1945, American forces had reached the Elbe River. Remagen was long behind them, but every man who'd been there carried the memory of that bridge, the clang of boots on steel, the smell of burning oil, the fear that each step might be the last. When Germany finally surrendered in May, Eisenhower reportedly told his staff, Remagen was the moment the war turned from inevitable victory to imminent victory. The Ludendorff Bridge itself never rose again. Its remains were left in the river as a silent monument, later salvaged for scrap. The stone towers, however, still stand today, scarred by shrapnel, but proud. They've been turned into a peace museum, where visitors can walk through exhibits built on the very ground where history pivoted. The legacy. Remagen wasn't just an engineering triumph. It was a symbol of momentum, courage, and improvisation. It showed the world what happened when ordinary soldiers seized opportunity instead of waiting for orders. It also shattered the myth of German invincibility. For the Wehrmacht, the crossing was proof that the Allies could outthink, outbuild, and outfight them, even at the gates of their homeland. For the men who crossed it, the bridge was both a doorway and a tomb, a structure that stood just long enough to carry them into the final chapter of the war. And in the history of World War II, the message of Remagen remains clear. Sometimes victory doesn't come from plans or maps. It comes from a moment of impossible luck, seized by those brave enough to act. The hidden stories of Remagen, eyewitnesses, civilians, and the bridge that refused to die. March 1945. The Rhine Valley, Germany. In the shadow of the collapsing Reich, life around the Ludendorff Bridge carried on, but barely. To the civilians of Remagen, the bridge wasn't just a structure, it was survival. The sound of Allied artillery had become constant, echoing across the hills like thunder that never stopped. In basements and cellars, families huddled together as bombs shook the walls. The smell of dust and burned timber filled the air. Some prayed, others just listened in silence, waiting for the next shell to hit. When the Americans arrived, many expected brutality. For years, Nazi propaganda had told them that Allied soldiers were monsters. But what they saw instead were men, young, muddy, tired, handing out rations and bandages instead of bullets. An elderly woman, Frau Ilse Weber, later recalled in her diary, "They came from the west like ghosts out of the smoke. One of them gave my grandson chocolate. It was the first sweet thing he had ever tasted." The Bridge Guards' final stand. Across the river in Erpel, the German defenders watched helplessly as wave after wave of Americans crossed the bridge. Their orders were to hold at all costs, but cost had become meaningless. Captain Willy Brattige, the man responsible for defending the Ludendorff Bridge, had done everything within his power to destroy it. His demolition crews had been too late, his men too few. When the Americans captured him, he reportedly looked across the water and muttered, "I failed my country." But historians would later see him differently. Not as a failure, but as a tragic figure trapped in a crumbling system. Had the detonators worked as planned, the Rhine might have held for weeks longer. But fate had other ideas. In the ruins of post-war Germany, Brattige was eventually released from Allied custody. He returned to civilian life quietly, rarely speaking of Remagen again. The unseen battle beneath the river. While the story of the crossing is often told from above the waterline, tanks, infantry, artillery, few know about the silent war fought beneath the river. German frogmen, members of the elite Kommando der Kleinkampfverbände, were ordered to destroy the bridge using floating mines and underwater charges. Night after night, they slipped into the icy current, trying to attach explosives to the bridge's supports. But American engineers had anticipated them. Spotlights swept the water, machine guns raked the surface, and depth charges detonated in the dark. The river became a killing field. One diver, Corporal Hans Dittmar, later recounted from captivity, "We could hear the bridge groaning above us, like a monster breathing. We tried to reach it, but the current was too strong. When the flares went up, it was as bright as day. Half of us never came back. It was a forgotten battle, fought in the cold, unseen, and ultimately lost." The day the bridge collapsed. When the Ludendorff Bridge finally gave way on March 17th, engineers on both sides felt the same shock. The Americans had come to see the bridge as invincible. The Germans, even in defeat, respected its endurance. Sergeant Bill McGee, one of the engineers stationed on the scaffolding, described the collapse. "We'd been repairing bomb hits for 10 days straight. When it started to sway, we thought it was another shell. Then the whole thing went fast. You could feel it go through your feet, like a heartbeat that just stopped." The wreckage sank into the Rhine with a hiss of steam and twisted steel. The bridge was gone, but its spirit lingered. The men who had crossed it said it felt as if the structure itself had chosen the moment to die, only after completing its purpose. Post-war Remagen, from battlefield to memory. After the war, Remagen lay in ruins, but among the destruction, something remarkable happened. The people decided not to rebuild the bridge. The stone towers at either end, pocked with bullet holes and blackened by explosions, were left standing. In time, they became known as the Peace Towers. In 1980, they were transformed into the Remagen Peace Museum, dedicated to reconciliation and remembrance. Inside, visitors can still see photographs of the battle, uniforms, twisted beams from the original span, and the personal effects of soldiers, both American and German. Every spring, veterans and their families returned. They stood by the river, some in silence, others sharing stories. American engineers would meet the German villagers they once fought near, shaking hands where machine guns once fired. One U.S. veteran, Corporal Donald Keller, returned in 1969 and met an elderly woman who had hidden in a cellar during the battle. He gave her a Hershey bar, the same kind the GIs had handed out in 1945. They both cried. "I came back to see the bridge," he said, "but all I found was peace." And that was enough. The bridge's place in history. Today, the story of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen stands as one of the most daring moments of the Second World War. It wasn't the biggest battle or the bloodiest, but it was symbolic, a flashpoint where courage, luck, and timing intersected perfectly. For the Americans, it proved that no obstacle was insurmountable. For the Germans, it marked the final unraveling of the Reich's defenses. And for the civilians who lived through it, it was the moment when war finally reached their door, and then passed through it. The bridge remains a lesson written in steel and blood, that even in chaos, opportunity can change the course of history if seized with courage. Epilogue. The sound of boots on iron. As the years passed, the river healed. The Rhine flows quietly now, its surface smooth where once the echo of artillery rolled. The towers stand guard over the water, not as sentinels of war, but as keepers of memory. Every March, locals gather to lay wreaths and light candles. They speak softly of the young men who crossed, the Americans chasing victory, the Germans defending their homeland, and the civilians caught between them. Some nights, when the fog settles low over the water, old veterans swear they can still hear it. The distant clang of boots on steel, the heartbeat of the Ludendorff Bridge, carrying men across the last great river of the war.